Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Jim Stanford, I apologize, is my guest tonight. He is brilliant in regards to what's going on in regards to Trump threatened tariffs, trade, what's going on, what we should do, etc. He's posted frequently. He's written articles, he's written papers, and he's been on media talking about this topic. Jim, thank you for joining us. Tell us all, should we be worried?
Yeah, we should be very worried. We still don't know for sure how much of Trump's bluster and threats are just him out there, intimidating and confusing other countries and trying to build some bargaining leverage, maybe to go after some of his other so-called irritants like the border or defense spending or whatever. Or, more pessimistically, does he actually have grand territorial ambitions to go down in history as the US president who actually finished the job and completed Manifest Destiny and expanded the size of the United States to include Canada, Greenland, Panama, or whatever? Either
Manifest
way,
destiny? Seriously?
well, he's talking about expanding, using economic force to expand the borders, to erase the artificial line, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you'd have said this to me a year ago, I'd say, "Oh, come on, you're reading too many conspiracy theories." But listening to his repeated comments since the election, he's going to come in Monday with some kind of shock and awe program. And again, we don't know how much of it is aimed at specific demands and how much of it is motivated by some kind of grand vision for himself and his country. But the reality is he's there and he is the biggest boy on the block. And so Canada has to figure out how to deal with him.
Jim Stanford, you've got an incredible background. You're economist and director at the Center for Future Work. You've been an honorary professor of political economy at the University of Sydney in Sydney, Australia, an industry professor of economics at McMaster University, an economist at Unifor, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on. Um, you've got a PhD, a master's, a bachelor's, and a lot more. Have you ever been in this situation? Have we ever been in this situation before? Did you ever think
No,
we'd be in this situation?
well, we haven't been in this situation, but Brian, if you take the long view of history, Canada has always had to confront a kind of existential question from the beginning. We were always organized and defined in some kind of contradistinction to the elephant just to the south of us. We're the mouse, as Pierre Trudeau famously said, in bed with the elephant. And right from the beginning, from the initial, the four provinces, and then the Confederation, and then the national policy and the railroad, it was all defined by the need to create a critical mass for a country that was not just the northern hinterland of a bigger country that basically absorbed the whole continent. So in one way, it isn't new. In one way, this is just more of the same for the challenges facing Canada. But obviously, this is a new era and a new way of doing it. So we have spent the last generation, over 30 years, constructing a so-called rules-based world trading system where countries in the world would deal with each other according to a certain set of rules. And, we could have arguments about whether that was exactly the right rule book or not and what could be changed in it, but it was supposed to not be a world where brute force prevailed. And we seem to be heading back towards a situation where Mr. Trump is willing to use and leverage the power that comes from being the biggest to try and extract concessions or tell other countries what to do. So then in economic terms, Brian, there's no doubt that this whole thing of the 25% tariff in aggregate is going to hurt Americans as much as it hurts Canadians. So, they are going to suffer from the tariff because the things that we sell them are not, consumer goods that are on the shelf at Costco that you just pick off and say, oh, made in Canada. Hey, I'd rather it be made in America. That's kind of the stereotype. But 76% of what we sell to the Americans are inputs to American businesses. Everything from energy and minerals to forestry products, agricultural commodities, parts for cars and other machinery, semi-finished goods, industrial materials, et cetera, et cetera. So a 25% tariff is going to make those purchases 25% more expensive for American companies, which is going to unleash all kinds of problems. inflation in the US, for starters. The last thing we need is another bounce in inflation. We thought we'd finally gotten it under control. Secondly, it's going to make US businesses less competitive, including in export markets. So it's in a way, it's going to hurt America's trade more than it helps them. So the pain for Americans from that, let alone from any retaliation that we put on, and we will, is going to be severe. But because they're 10 times bigger, proportionately, it's not the same emergency as it would be for us. And we have, in a way, put too many of our eggs, it seems, in this one basket of relying on the U.S. as a convenient, large, prosperous market right next to us and trying to trade our way to prosperity. So this will be a painful experience and probably a wake-up call for Canadians that we have to think a bit more about how do we meet our own needs as a country rather than assuming that trade alone will do it.
So if it is going to have an impact, not as big, but an impact, a negative impact on American consumers, if it's going to probably recreate the inflation challenges that the United States has had and has somewhat, if not completely, solved in the last couple of years, if it's going to create huge issues with their northern neighbor, why is the United States, why is Trump going to do it? What's the benefit?
That's the $1 trillion question, Brian. $1 trillion, by the way, is the size of the two-way trade flow between Canada and the United States. $1 trillion a year crosses the border one way or the other in goods and services, the biggest trading relationship in the world. And why does Mr. Trump want to mess with it? First of all, his identifying tariffs as a magic bullet to solve all of America's problems had a political function during his campaign. So he stressed tariffs as a way to rebuild America first, to pay for stuff that the government must do, to offset the lost revenue from the big tax cuts he wants to bring in. And I think he relied on a lack of, understanding in the public at large about what a tariff is. He claimed that it would mean that foreigners would be paying for all this stuff, but in fact, it will be Americans paying for this stuff. It is Americans who have to pay that tariff to the American government, not us. We will get obviously side effects from it, but the actual payment will be done by Americans. And he used it to great success during his election campaign. And, there's been a lot of almost sort of psychoanalysis of Mr. Trump and looking back at his famous book, The Art of the Deal, and his so-called bargaining tactics, thinking, this could be a way to get the other side scared, have a big hammer on the other side, and then sit down and negotiate other stuff. Obviously, I hope that's true. But even if it is true, Brian, it's still bad because what if this happens, if he uses the threat of a 25% tariff to extract, X, Y, and Z from us, including on things that are equally mythical as his so-called big trade deficit problem. Mythical things like the border. The border is a problem, but it is mostly stuff coming up to Canada, not the other way, that is the problem. So, if he does this and succeeds, and he's going to do it again, and it's just a reminder that, hey, when you're dealing with a bully on a day-to-day basis, you got to be prepared to A, stand up to the bully, and B, walk away when you need to and do something else. And in our economy, that would mean finding other export markets to sell our stuff to, Europe and Asia and so on. That's
But
a
we've been
long,
talking about that
hard
for
process.
not 30 years, more than 50 years. We've been
Yeah.
talking about diversifying and
Yes.
the third option and going to
Right.
Europe, going to China, going to
hmm
Asia Pacific. We haven't done it.
No, we haven't because it's hard, and the power, the gravitational pull of the U.S. market right next to us, combined with the free trade agreements, which really integrated our supply chains. This is the reality of why a tariff from the U.S. is actually going to hurt them more than
So
it helps them because the supply chains are so integrated. There's stuff that, a car, for example, parts of a car across the border 6 or 8 times before it's a finished car. And this is going to be very, very hard to disentangle. So that option of looking for other trading partners, you're right, long-standing, hard to do. Another option is going to be to reorient our production around meeting the needs of Canadians, make stuff and sell them to Canadians and put more investment and economic energy into stuff Canadians need, like housing and infrastructure and so on. That's another part of the solution.
You mentioned the art of the deal. When I've commented negatively about what the threat is, people have often commented about the art of the deal, where Trump talks very openly in his book about taking a very extreme position. And some people have described it as sort of the theory of outrageous negotiations, that you start with this outrageous
Hmm.
position, so that when you come back to a more reasonable position, people think that, oh my God, I've solved everything. I've saved my butt. Is that what he's doing, or and so we shouldn't therefore worry, or what?
It could be what he's doing, and if you read Robert Lighthizer book, he will be Trump's main man on trade issues. He proposes kind of similar things: make a big threat, set a deadline, and then go in and extract some contract concessions. And that could be it. I think Trump's reputation as a master negotiator is, is somewhat misplaced. He loves to put himself at the center of everything, whether it's a TV show or running a country. But he didn't negotiate very well when he was when he was president the first time. There was all kinds of problems in the world, whether it was dealing with Vladimir Putin or even the way that we renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement. He made a big deal out of that, and frankly, there wasn't much difference between it and the one that came before. So the idea that he is a master negotiator, I think, is questionable. I think it's more that he's playing for a political audience at home and perhaps motivated by some other big dream about what his true legacy will be at the end of his second term, possibly a bigger United States.
We're chatting with Jim Stanford, a economist, political commentator, a gentleman that has understood a lot of what's going on between Canada and the United States extremely well. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes, and we're going to delve into this manifest destiny idea. We're going to talk more about the free trade agreements that we've had in the past, and we're going to talk about what the potential Canadian reaction and solutions are. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes, because this is really the number one topic of now. And I agree with Jim that this is got to be one of, if not the biggest threats that Canada has ever faced. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Jim Stanford. He is an economist. He is a commentator. He's got a really interesting position at the Center for Future Work, where he's an economist and director. He's been a professor of political economy. It seems like you've been everywhere in Sydney and McMaster and Unifor, all over the map. You've been an economist and a director. You've got a PhD, a master's, a bachelor's in economics from Calgary, from Cambridge, from the New School for Social Research. You've got a pretty good resume, sir.
Well, thank you, Brian. One of the things I'm proudest about, Brian, frankly, and it's up the alley of your audience, was the 23 years I spent as economist with the Canadian Auto Workers and then Unifor. And so I really got to immersed in this whole issue of the cross-border integration of our manufacturing sector, autos, obviously, but all kinds of other stuff, and how important that integration of the supply chains has become since the 80s. We produce parts that the Americans use to produce sub-assemblies that they send back to us that we install in sub-assemblies, and then we send back to them and they do a finished car with it, or vice versa. And the intensity of the intertwining of all those activities is really something to behold. It's an extraordinary story of how industries develop. But the problem is now it'll be as hard to disentangle those as it would be to unmake an omelet, right? You can't take an omelet and put it back in the eggs. So
Well, what you're
in
saying
this
is
regard, we've got a challenge.
it was almost a mistake to become so reliant on that when we've got the risk of someone tearing up the agreement or threatening to tear up the agreement. And should we have done something where we were more integrated with Europe or Asia?
Or at least maintained the capacity to do it ourselves as a plan B. I think that we did underestimate how vulnerable we would be once we threw in our hat to, we'll just become part of an integrated North American continent. I mean, there are very good economic reasons why doing stuff on a continental level makes sense, and the auto industry is case positive. We were doing that long before the free trade agreement. we had the Canada-U.S. Auto Pact dating back to 1965 that, frankly, I would say is the most successful trade agreement ever. And it was different than the modern ones. It wasn't just, we'll throw it open and may the best man win. It was actually a kind of a sharing, saying this is a vital industry and everyone's going to have a fair share of it. And it was marvelous for laying the groundwork for Canada's auto industry and all of the other industries that depend on it. Um, but, at a minimum, I think that we overestimated how a piece of paper, which ultimately is what that free trade agreement is, could protect us against arbitrary U.S. actions. And that was a storyline. I was around in the 80s when we were debating free trade. And Mr. Mulroney, the prime minister at the time, and the trade negotiators on our side, Simon Weissman and others, said, this agreement will protect us against unilateral action, like the softwood lumber tariffs that we'd been fighting over for ages. Well, guess what? We're still fighting over softwood lumber tariffs. And now Mr. Trump just says, I don't care about any piece of paper. I'm going to do this anyway. So I think that we were naive in thinking that just signing that deal and the concessions we made to get that deal, including some pretty far-reaching commitments around energy security for the Americans with our energy. We were naive that that alone would protect us, and we should
But
have.
how can you
I
do
think,
this? We do have a agreement. We've got a treaty
yeah,
that is legally binding. 5 years ago or 4 years ago, he put in place some tariffs on
yes,
steel, but he justified it based on national emergency.
yes.
Like, how does he actually do these 25% tariffs?
Well, he may declare national emergency. That's one of the theories for the sort of shock and awe measures that he'll bring in after inauguration. He could declare it a national emergency. That would just be a lie. It's ridiculous to say that the trade situation is a national emergency. America has a trade deficit. Yes, they've had a trade deficit, Brian, for the last 49 years. And it's a very, very safe bet that it will be 50 in 2025. It's a structural feature of the American economy that they buy more stuff from the rest of the world than they sell to the rest of the world. Why? Because there's a constant inflow of capital from the rest of the world to America. Countries, central banks, banks, investors around the world are always buying U.S. assets because they want to have a piece of the action at the center of, the capitalist world economy, whether it's government bonds or property in New York. So that inflow of capital allows America to buy more stuff than they sell. And there's nothing new about it. And it's, in fact, shrunk. The trade deficit today is smaller than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So it is not an emergency, but that's could be the legal hook, or I'm sure he can find some other way. So we thought that a treaty meant something, and Mr. Trump is proving that it doesn't. We still need the active buy-in from whoever is the leader at any point in time. And, I think that's probably obvious. But, we were the Boy Scouts who put on our uniform and said, okay, let's play by the rules, everyone, including you, the big guy, 10 times my size.
So this issue of the Canadian dollar versus the U.S. dollar and the trade deficit, I wonder if you could explain from an economic standpoint. So Trump has argued that he wants and likes the American dollar being the sort of reserve currency of the world, the most powerful currency, and likes the value of the American currency. But at the same time, he doesn't want the trade deficit, and the two sort of go together because if he erases the trade deficit, there's not going to be as much purchasing of American dollars, and so therefore the American currency won't be as valued the way it is today, and won't be as strong as a reserve currency, I think. Can you explain that if possible?
Yeah, you're quite right, Brian, to show the sort of contradiction in that thinkings, or, I guess since we're talking about money, the two sides of the coin. On the one hand, the fact that the U.S. currency is the reserve currency is one of the main reasons for those big capital inflows that I talked about. Central banks around the world keep a huge number of U.S. government bonds, and they buy them regardless of what the interest rate is. So, and same goes for private banks, and same goes for investors. But on the downside, you have to get a trade deficit from it. That's how it adds up. You have to do something with the money, and directly or indirectly, they buy stuff from the rest of the world. So he is trying to have his cake and eat it too, in terms of having the strong dollar, being able to basically print money that the rest of the world uses. That's more or less what it means, which is a great thing for America. but not experience the so-called trade deficit. I honestly, in his heart of hearts, I do not think he believes the trade deficit is a problem. I suspect him and his team have, just cottoned onto this as a great kind of flag waving slogan that helped him get elected, and it did help him get elected. That kind of protectionist America First rhetoric. In the case of Canada, the lies are even more obtuse. He claims that they have a trade deficit with Canada, and they do. That means that we sell a bit more goods and services there than they sell in Canada. He claimed it was $200 billion, absolutely made up. There's no basis to fact for that number. The American numbers say it was $40 billion in 2023, and it shrank further in 2024. But the idea then that that deficit constitutes a subsidy for Canada, he's saying that America is bailing out Canada because of this trade deficit, is just nonsense. That's not it at all. If anything, we're subsidizing them. First of all, by giving them the money to buy the stuff from us, and Canadians do that too. There's a lot of Canadian capital flowing into America. But more importantly, through some of the other sweet deals that the Americans get out of North American trade. Number one, energy. So we supply 55% of the imported oil to the United States now. And if that was not there, they'd have an energy crisis that would make the 1970s OPEC shocks look like kindergarten. It would be unbelievable. They could not function. There would be an all-out crisis. Number two, services trade. Trump only talks about commodities. He never talks about services. Why? Because the American companies have got a lock in services trade. The big banks, the big tech companies, the big streaming companies make tens of billions of dollars off Canada every year. And it usually doesn't even show up in the trade statistics because so much of it is digital, we can't even track it, let alone tax it. So this is how they actually are subsidized. Meta, Google, Amazon, Uber, they all have huge market shares in Canada, and they don't generally pay taxes on what they make because they can manipulate where their profits show up internationally. That's a subsidy. Then the capital flows I mentioned, Canadians have, for example, lent America about $700 billion in short-run debt and T-bills and so on. And this
$700 billion we've lent?
700 billion, yeah, more than enough to finance that bilateral trade deficit. And here's the biggest irony of all. Normally, when you lend someone money, they pay you interest, right? That's how it works. Go to the bank, get a mortgage, you pay the bank interest. With the Canada-US debt, they owe us money, but we pay them interest. The net flow of interest and profits and dividends on investment income, $13 billion going that way, not this way. So that's another weird way that we subsidize the Americans in this whole deal.
Let's come back to energy for a second. You're saying that 50% of American energy imports are from Canada. I understand that the U.S. actually is an energy exporter today. So what I've been told is that they import natural gas, oil, other petroleum products, energy products from Canada, and that allows them to then take their products and sell them externally. And sometimes they actually take our natural gas and liquefy it and send it out. But in other times, they just take our energy, use it, and use their energy to sell worldwide. And they're buying our energy at 80% of world prices and selling their energies at world prices. And so therefore, don't you need to sort of think about both their imports and their exports together? And aren't we subsidizing them because we're a cost of goods in their ultimate sale of energy at higher prices worldwide?
Yeah, you've nailed it again, Brian. If this radio business doesn't work out for you, go into economics. You're you're hitting home runs. That is exactly what's happening. Now, on a net basis, America is still an energy importer. Yes, they do export some oil, but they import a lot more than they export. So on a net basis, they need the rest of the world, and they need Canada more than anyone else. There's a chart in the report we issued this week. The report's called "Who's Subsidizing Whom?" And being Canadian, I want to stress the good grammar that I had in that title, Brian, the whom. But there's a chart in there that knocked my own socks off, and I made the chart to show the sources of crude oil imports to the United States. And here's a humongous bar for Canada, and then all these dinky little ones for Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Venezuela and even Mexico. So they absolutely need our oil, but they do get it at a discount for different reasons. Number one, the quality of the oil. We produce the heavier stuff. Number two, the infrastructure setup, which kind of integrates Canada's oil into America's refinery network, and so on. So they do get a good deal on it, and then they manufacture it and add value and sell it, sometimes back to us. We import refined petroleum products from the United States made with Canadian friggin' oil. So
You're
why do
kidding.
we do that? Why do we
Why do
do
we do
that?
that?
Why didn't we do it ourselves?
Why don't we refine it ourselves?
Exactly. Exactly. But there's certain segments of the oil industry that think it's more profitable just to sell the stuff instead of building expensive refineries. But as a country, this is a failure. And
So
that failure is over and over again in other industries where we export the raw material and import the finished product, which is not a winning deal.
while we're on this topic, I got to ask you about Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, and her response
Hmm.
that the federal government's got to leave oil off energy off the table in regards to retaliatory tariffs, and her arguments that rather than retaliatory tariffs, we should be immediately building pipelines to the East Coast, et cetera. What do you think of Danielle Smith's strategy in regards to energy?
Oh, it's very unfortunate on several grounds. Obviously, by going down to Mar-a-Lago and sucking up to Mr. Trump and begging for an exemption, that's what she was doing. She's signaling Canadian weakness to Mr. Trump, and Mr. Trump will be thrilled by that. He will say those Canadians can't even get their act together. I'll walk over them. Number two, her analysis of the economics of it are wrong. The issue is not cut off all their oil or do nothing. Okay, there's lots of ways that we could get some leverage from the oil, among other things. It's not just oil. Every industry in Canada is going to have to play a role, and every province is going to have to play a role. And Alberta won't be disproportionately carrying the burden, not at all. One idea would be to actually just restrain the supply to America. Oil markets are fairly finely balanced. It doesn't take a whole lot of messing around on the supply side to get the price moving quickly. And what they've done in Alberta in the past, like during the COVID pandemic, and also earlier when there were pipeline shortages. Those pipeline shortages are not binding today, but they were a few years ago. They had a thing where they organized where all of the producers in Alberta reduced their production by a little bit, and it was through a government energy agency that this was coordinated. And what it does is it gives everyone the share of the smaller pie, but it also lifted the revenues considerably, and you actually made more money selling less oil. That would be a very creative way to put some pressure on the Americans without harming Alberta's oil industry at all. But I think
OPEC has done that successfully time after time.
yes, exactly. And this is different because it's just Alberta planning their own oil production and sharing it across the companies. But it is the same principle. And I think Premier Smith is playing politics as well, just like Mr. Trump is. She wants to position herself as the one fighting for Alberta, and unfortunately,
She
it
seems
helps
to
her.
be fighting more against Canada than she is against Trump.
Absolutely. No, and
How does that make sense?
she's decided that's going to play in Alberta. Now, I'm an Albertan, born, raised there, and I don't believe that Albertans don't care about Canada. I think they do. And I'm not sure that this strategy is even going to pay off for her politically. We'll see. We're already seeing some.
Ford's comeback. You got to
Yes.
fight for your jurisdiction, but you're Canadian first. Do you think
Hmm.
that resonates in Alberta?
I think it does. Yeah. And then I think Mr. Ford's political success by putting on that Canada hat and positioning himself as Captain Canada, and he's obviously getting lots and lots of support for that view. I think that will resonate in Alberta as well. And frankly, I think it'll resonate in federal politics as well. It's going to be a very interesting time.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Jim Stafford. I'm going to ask him about this manifest destiny, because it's a really important topic that you've raised as well, sir. Back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking with economist Jim Stanford today about Trump, tariffs, and other issues. You raised a couple of minutes ago this idea of manifest destiny. and Greenland and Panama and Canada. And several people, commentators, have commented that he almost sounds like Putin or Xi. And the arguments that Putin made in regards to the security, the foreign security, the national security of Russia needing to control Ukraine is sort of comparable to the way he's described that Trump has described the need to control Greenland and Black Sea, Panama are similar. Are we talking about someone that is actually more like Putin and Xi than we'd like to admit?
Brian, I don't know, and to some extent I do like to stick to my knitting as an economist. I know the economy and the numbers and so on. I'm out of my depth on some of this kind of geopolitical stuff, but it is certainly alarming. The combination of the seeming ambition of his rhetoric, to expand the United States and erase so-called artificial lines, as he called the Canada-U.S. border. It isn't an artificial line. It means a lot, not just to sort of symbolic things and national sovereignty. It means a lot to our economy. The fact that that line is there is one of the reasons that we were able to build a modern, high-tech industrial economy north of that line. If it wasn't, most of Canada would look like North Dakota, the hinterland of a continental mass where the big action was occurring in the centralized cities of, LA and San Francisco and New York and Chicago. So the border is not an artificial line. It means something, but he's talking about getting rid of it. I was a teenager in the 70s. I don't know if you would remember this book, Brian, or not. Richard Romer, he was a Canadian general, and he wrote this book called Ultimatum, and then a sequel called Exoneration about the U.S. invading Canada. And it was, far-fetched, of course, but he was a real Canadian patriot, and he told this kind of action story in the novels about America invading and then the Canadian military responding in surprising ways. Perhaps like the Ukraine military has responded in surprising ways to keep Russia at bay, whereas we all thought it would be over in weeks. But anyways, it was kind of a romantic, patriotic action novel, but it's kind of stuck with me. And lo and behold, Richard Romer's still alive. I saw him on TV just the other day talking about the books and how they've kind of come back to relevance. It is hard to believe. You know who is, I think, suffering the most would be all of those trade negotiators who, in all sincerity, Canadian government officials, international affairs people who dedicated their careers to trying to negotiate this rules-based system, to see it ripped up in an instant by, a megalomaniac. And in that regard, we're in uncharted territory, and I think Canadians have to treat this as an emergency and be prepared for some sacrifices. And know that at the end of the day, it's going to determine whether we remain viable as a project, a separate project from the United States, with lots in common but lots of differences. And I think the next few years, regardless of whether Trump goes ahead with the 25% tariff, this is a wake-up call for us.
Jim Balsillie wrote a column in the National Post this week that argued that we hadn't done as good a job negotiating the trade agreements with the United States as he argued we needed to. We were more interested in things like auto and goods trade than about intellectual property and protecting the ability for Canadian companies that were high tech or biotech based on intellectual property to grow. Do you have an opinion on that, sir?
Well, I mean, hindsight is 2020, and I've got lots of ideas about how that free trade agreement, the original one in 1989, and then its descendants, could have been improved and could have had more protections for our ability as a country to build a full, well-rounded economy, industrial economy, including R&D and IP and so on, which is his concern, but. I wouldn't downplay the importance of auto and aerospace and telecommunications and some of the other things where we had a strong foothold. So the problem that we're in now is, that was then and this is now. So we're going to need, I think, some emergency measures to support our exporting companies and facilities in Canada so that they can survive this and stay alive, and hopefully reorient a bit, retool to focus more on Canadian consumers or third country exports rather than being or to fill the void that's left if our exports to the US falter. Secondly, we're going to need lots of emergency support for the workers. Premier Ford said 500,000 in Ontario. Premier Eby out here in BC said 125,000 here. And it will be similar in other provinces. There's no province, not even Alberta, that's going to escape this. So in that regard, we're going to need, frankly, something akin to the CERB and all those other emergency programs that came in during the pandemic to help people keep their homes and keep their families together as this unfolds. And then I do think we're going to need to rethink our whole vision for economic development and developing industries, including high-tech industries. It's not enough to say we'll sell it to the U.S. We're next to the U.S. Come to Canada, make your stuff here for cheap, and sell it in the U.S. That has been our motto for the last 30 years. And investors aren't going to believe that anymore. This again is where the damage has already been done by Mr. Trump, because he's raised the question of whether we can export to the U.S. or not. And that is going to infect the minds of businesses thinking about where they want to put their next facility for years and years and years to come. And so whatever happens now, we are going to need a new strategy to build a Canadian economy that's more diversified and perhaps more focused on our own needs rather than exports.
Can we afford it? I followed your writing when you were with Unifor, and my sense, and this may not be accurate, but my sense was that you were more of a progressive economist than sort of the mainstream economist writers in Canada, that you believed in industrial strategy and things like that. In the last couple of years in the United States, President Biden has put in place with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the
Yes.
CHIPS Act, with things like that, things that I would have thought of as typically industrial strategy oriented. The Canadian deficit as a percentage of GDP people complain about, but it's actually less than 2%, while the United States deficit is over 6%, more than 3 times higher. Ford is talking about spending billions of dollars if he has to combat what the Trump tariffs would do. Do we need an industrial strategy kind of deficit spending in Canada? Can we afford it? Is that the right strategy, or should we just reduce taxes?
You've really highlighted the important choices again, Brian. You're quite right. And it is interesting to point how the Americans, even before Mr. Biden, even though they talk about the free market and everything, they have always pursued a very active industrial strategy. Industrial strategy means using the tools of government, taxes and subsidies and trade rules and technology supports to try and develop industries that are more attractive or that are high value industries. So you've got more of them there. And the Americans have always done this, using their military budget, using the Department of Energy, obviously using the university system and fostering this whole high-tech thing, obviously in Silicon Valley, but elsewhere in America. And Mr. Biden took it to a new level, including the renewable energy and tying that into electric vehicles and everything else. Canada tried to keep pace. We've had our own strategies around transitioning the auto industry towards electric vehicles, battery plants, retooling the supply chain, et cetera. I think all of that was well put. But again, Mr. Trump is so unpredictable. We don't know yet what's going to happen to that Inflation Reduction Act and all of those industrial measures. So we'll have to be nimble in responding to it. But we absolutely do need it. Otherwise, we will simply be a supplier of raw materials to the rest of the world. That will be it. We wouldn't have an auto industry. We wouldn't have an aerospace industry. We wouldn't have a pharmaceuticals industry. We wouldn't have a telecom industry. We wouldn't have Mr. Balsilly's, legacy that he's left. None of that without active industrial strategies to foster and support those types of activities, where otherwise we would go into resource extraction, real estate, and banking. That would be Canada's economy.
I went to a speech by David Frum, Republican speechwriter, anti-Trump, and he said, believe Trump about tariffs. He took out a full-page ad in 1987 complaining about unfair Japanese and Chinese trade practices and declared the desire for tariffs then. Frum went on further and said, Trump actually loves the idea of the Gilded Age back in the 1880s, 1890s, where there was no income tax. The government was financed completely by tariffs. And so he said, believe Trump on tariffs. You said you don't think he'll put in the tariffs. It's only political. What's your response to David Frum?
Oh, I don't think I said I don't think he would. I said that's one theory. One theory is that he's using this as bargaining leverage and then he'll negotiate something else. But I'm not convinced of that. So I follow David Frum as well. He's brilliant, and I think he's absolutely correct. That you cannot underestimate what Trump's ultimate goal is. And this Gilded Age, you want to see the Gilded Age, go down to Mar-a-Lago and see him and his cronies and every billionaire in the country lining up to pay homage to the new emperor. And this is, I think, a frightening prospect for our economy, obviously, as we're discussing, but frankly, a frightening prospect for democracy. And we've seen a definite crumbling around the edges of how democracy works in America, with everything from restrictions on voting to Supreme Court judges who are bribed, in essence, as their careers on go, to the very, very close link between billionaires and policymakers, to the point that, as in Elon Musk, you can't tell which is which. So I think, Mr. Frum's warning is well placed indeed.
I got to ask you one last question. Um, some people have been saying this is the worst possible time to have an election. That we're in chaos. I actually think it's really good because we'll end up having a conversation about exactly what we need to do and what the right strategies are and who we want to give a mandate to negotiate going forward. And I worry that if you have a government that had a mandate from the past, or you had an election back in the fall, we would have been fighting the issues of 2022, 2023, 2024, when what we got to do is address the issues of 2025. Is an election right now a good idea in your mind to focus us on what we need going forward? Or no, what we need is just to come together and have consistent leadership?
Oh, that's again a question where I'm out of my depth as an economist. I do think that it's important to remember that machinery of government is still working. Some people are saying, well, we can't do anything because the parliament's been prorogued, and that's not how it works. You've got ministers and civil servants and trade negotiators all working as hard as they possibly can. So in the immediate sense, that's not the issue. Now, the question of the political uncertainty and the divisiveness that we've seen in our political discourse in Canada, obviously we're going to settle it sometime with an election. We still don't know exactly when that'll be, but it looks like it'll be late in the spring. And Mr. Trump is going to play off that divisiveness. We've already seen him and Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson kind of taking sides in our internal political debates. Well, I guess Jordan Peterson is Canadian, so he can jump in, but
Kevin
he works
O'Leary,
closely
Daniel
with
Smith
the others.
as well.
Yeah. So we are seeing, I think, obviously a divisiveness in our political discourse that doesn't help at this moment. I would like to see people from all parties take a step back and look at the bigger picture here, and in a kind of a national unity kind of government or common front sort of thing. And 9 of the 10 premiers did that the other day, from all political stripes, including Mr. Ford, obviously. So in that regard, I do think there's a higher calling right now, and I do hope that some of the politicians can resist the temptation to just try and score gotcha points and recognize there's something bigger at stake.
I think there is something very big at stake right now, and I do think there's huge risk for the Canadian economy and for all of us. And so, Jim Stanford, I really appreciate the role that you're playing in educating us and telling us some of the facts. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you for the role you're playing, trying to get some of those facts out there. Thank you.
We're going to take a final break, and I'm going to come back with some of my own concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Stafford.